Happy Friday. Happy Friday. Really excited to see all of you here in the room. And I am so excited about this conversation because I am joined by one of my favorite facilitators. So she is a woman I've had an opportunity to work with in person and virtually, and she is amazing. But before we get into my guest co-host, of today. I just want to thank all of you so much for taking the time to join me today. You could be anywhere, but you're here, and I really do appreciate that. This is really meant to be an opportunity for us to connect, learn, and share. And I know that this topic sometimes can get a little heated, so let's keep that in mind as we share our perspective and as we ask questions. All right. We want to make sure that this is as interactive as possible. So please feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask a question or share your perspective. I want to see as many of you as possible on this stage, right? Because it's not just about me or my co-host, it's about all of us and having this conversation together. A quick introduction for those of you maybe who don't know me. Hello, hi. My name is Ikria. I also respond to Aqua and Akua. I'm a certified executive leadership coach, learning and development facilitator and speaker. And I also have my own podcast called the Open Door Conversations Podcast. A quick plug, we actually just released our first interview of 2023. So please take a listen if you have a few minutes. It's a really great interview all about the importance of liking yourself if you're a leader. All right, I'd love to turn it over to my co-host, Angela, to introduce herself. And then we're going to get into our questions. Angela, or Angie, can you please take a second to let us all know who you are?
Yes, please call me Angie for starts. My name is Angie Gachui. I am a couple of things. I'm the head of transformation and inclusion at Girl Effect, but I'm also a DEI. I call myself a practitioner and champion, not an expert, because I don't actually know what a DEI expert is. We haven't reached that place yet. And I'm also a coach. So as you said, you and I have had the pleasure of facilitating a number of things together. And it's just a pleasure to be here. I'm Kenyan. I'm based in Kenya. I can see some people here that I know. Thank you for joining. And I'm really, really excited about this conversation.
Yes, Angie, thank you so much for that. And just as a quick intro, right? I have found that DEI can be a very polarizing issue in any organization. And one of the reasons why I even wanted to have this conversation is that I think it really should be a topic that everyone is thinking about, especially leaders on the African continent. And I think that there are so many opportunities for us to create more inclusive, more diverse environments, but we don't always take those opportunities because there are a lot of stories we tend to tell ourselves. There's lots of things that might get into the way of really being able to create those safe spaces so that we truly can innovate, right? So that we truly can pull everyone up and give everyone access to additional economic opportunities. So to start us off, Angie, can you please tell us a little bit about the numerous dimensions of diversity? Because one of the things that we first discussed when I approached you about joining me on this conversation was that so many leaders tend to focus on the fact that all of us have pretty similar skin colors. And because of that, right, talking and thinking about DEI isn't important. So can you tell us about the different dimensions of diversity that maybe we don't always consider and that leaders need to keep in mind?
Yeah. I love that question because when I do my trainings, this is the place that I start, which is the dimensions of diversity. And it starts from the recognition that even as individuals, if you go down to the core of like our personality, that is a dimension of diversity because that affects how we show up in the world, in the workplace, in our interactions with one another, our likes, our preferences, where we get energy from, etc. So even if you just started there, it doesn't matter whether you and I were born in the same household, raised by the same parents, same race, same religion, same, even if we were twins, right? If one of us was born of a different personality type, we will have a very different way of engaging with the world, right? And vice versa. So that's probably the first dimension of diversity. Then you go to the second dimension, which I consider to be more biological. So things that you may be born with or into that you technically have no control over, right? You have no control over whether you're born to a mixed race, environment, right? That was the decision of your parents. They met each other, they married, and you are either, African and African, or African and Asian, or Asian and European, and there's nothing you can do about that. That's just the way it was. You may have been born into a specific religion, you were born in a specific year, which puts you in a certain generation. And so you may have been born with a disability, and some of these things are way outside of our natural control, but they are a biological dimension. What happens with that is that that's actually where we see the largest amount of unconscious bias happening, right? Or discrimination happening. And yet what's so interesting about it is that's not the thing that you can control. You can't control if you were born white or black. That's just the way you were born. But when we look at where most people are interacting with from a diversity and inclusion conversation, it's really limited to that. If you go further out, obviously you get into things like education and professional experience, political perspectives, etc. And I think it's really important to just be aware that there's so much more to diversity than just your skin color, right? There's so much more to diversity than even your sexual orientation. And if I was doing this as a training, I would put a star there, because I do know there are some individuals who they've made a choice around their sexual orientation, and there's always a debate, an active debate, as to whether it is it's choice or whether you're born with a certain orientation. But basically it's like personality, then you have biology, and then you have sort of like experiential. And then there's another dimension, which I think all of us will be, in a unique category, given that we've gone through a pandemic. Our world now, whether it's around how we interact socially or how we show up professionally, has been influenced by what happened 2020 to COVID is still around, right? So to now.
Yeah.
And you find that similar to, people who may have lived through the Holocaust, for example, or, closer home, people who lived through apartheid or through the genocide in Rwanda. Those are sort of like epic events that happen, in the world that frame your worldview. And that in and of itself is.
Did I lose you there, Angie? Angie, can you hear me? Okay. I'm not sure if anyone else can hear Angie. Can people let me know, just maybe with the emoji, just react really quickly? Can you still hear? Just give me a thumbs up if you can still hear her. You can still hear. Okay. Okay. All right. I think we lost her. Let's bring her back up. Angie, can you please raise your hand? And if anyone else wants to contribute their perspective on the other dimensions that we should consider, please feel free to raise your hand as well at this time. I'd love to bring you on stage to have you add. Hi, Angie. Are you there? You're still on mute on my screen.
Can you hear me now? Can you
Yes.
hear me now?
Thank you so much.
Yay! Sorry.
Not a problem, please.
I don't know where I dropped off, but yeah, that's what I wanted to share. And I do see Akosia to join, so I'd love to hear her perspectives.
Please, Akosia. You're welcome to unmute and share.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate paying attention to how I've spelled out my name. Yes, thank you for this platform. I was just very interested in the topic when he said beyond race and LGBTQ plus and DEI in Africa. Obviously, when you're well educated, to me, it doesn't really change your perceptions about how you view DEI in your workplace or in your personal lives because of how culturally Africans are raised, right? Education may enlighten you, but it doesn't necessarily change your perception on anything. Maybe sometimes, but it doesn't necessarily mean because you're educated, this will change. So I just wanted to pose a question to either Angela or Kriya or anyone on the platform. How are you reconciling all this knowledge you've gained in the world about equity and equality and inclusion? How do you reconcile this if you are deeply rooted in your African upbringing?
Ooh, that is a very, very great question. Angie?
Yes, 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 yes.
Snaps.
Perfect kind of conversation for a Friday evening.
Yes.
You know what I think about, and I am by no means an African historian or anthropologist or cultural scholar, but one thing I know is diversity for us on the continent has existed even outside of like the cultural contexts that make us quote unquote African. But if you think about even, historically, we know that there were clans, and historically, we know that we have tribes and ethnicities that had their different and unique perspectives and behaviors that sometimes were more like there was more affinity one to another. Like if I speak about in Kenya, there are a certain number of tribes that are have a much more affinity. So the Kikuyu, the Embu, the Akamba, etc. And I'm sure if we go to other countries, we can find the same. But then there were other tribes that were very, very different, and you would find them on occasion, not simply because of resources, because oftentimes the warring was around resources, but there were disagreements because of language. There were disagreements because of practices, cultural practices and preferences. And so we have for the longest time had, maybe we didn't call it diversity, but we had cultural differences, right? And those showed up in a specific way. And so I like to think
Angie, are you there? I think we lost you.
I'm sure maybe perhaps anyone can chime in.
Yeah.
No, we're forgiven on technical challenges.
Of course. Yeah. No, I mean, it happens to the best of us. Does anyone in the audience want to share their perspective? Please feel free to raise your hand. As I mentioned earlier on in the introduction, this is really meant to be a conversation. We'd love to hear from you. And Ngozi, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
am I back?
Yes,
I keep
you are.
having to
Yes, Angie.
like
You were just talking about sort of the different groups.
yeah, sorry.
Oh, we might have lost Angie again, but Ngozi, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, please feel free to share your perspective. You're still muted.
Sorry about that. I was trying to sort out my mic as well because I'm in a public place. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, hi. And yes, you did pronounce my name correctly. It's Ngozi. I'm Nigerian. I think what I wanted to ask whilst we're waiting for Angela's network to come through for us is perhaps we need to, in Africa, there's a lot, it's very, very deep cultural and religious bias, if I should say, with regards to what consists of DEI. So when we speak race, that's easy to understand. There is not much race problem. We can move race to tribal issues. So for example, in a place like Nigeria, where we have a whole lot of tribes, there's a lot of conflict between tribes from time to time. Now, when it comes to the LGBTQ, it is something that is very challenged by the steep religious background that we all have. And so, if you were going to mention that upfront, I think you will find those people that you spoke to, shooing you all out of their offices and telling you they have nothing to do with your DEI conversation. Now, what I know, I was reading a book just recently, and we're talking about deliberate practice, deliberate training. This got nothing to do with this, but it's all about taking things one step at a time. Now, you're completely sure that there is a religious bias towards LGBTQ discussions in these areas, in these parts of the world. So, what do you do? Do you decide not to discuss DEI, or do you start somewhere? Persons with disabilities, for example. I mean, that's a situation that is just terribly rife in the African context, where you have a lot of us on the road, and most of them are persons with disabilities. How do we begin to help their cause? Perhaps if you focus more on that with regards to DEI rather than discussions around people's sexual orientation coming up front. I don't know if you get what I mean. I'm trying to just quickly round off so we can
Definitely.
get
Yeah.
Angela back on stage. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for joining us. I know earlier on you were saying you were going to be in a public space, so we really appreciate it. Angie, you're back. But I also just wanted to add, one of the reasons why we added that subtitle to this conversation was simply because of what you've just highlighted, that for so many leaders, the conversation of DEI is a non-starter because in their eyes, we all look the same. And in many countries, discussing anything LGBTQ plus related is illegal. So like you said, where can we start? So thank you so much for sharing that. Angie?
You're welcome.
Okay. While Angie is still working on her mic, does anyone else have anything else they want to share?
Check.
Okay. We can hear you. Yes.
Sorry, there's like a weird default mic and then choosing another mic. So I think that's what's going on. I may have missed the first part of Ngozi's statement, but I think I caught the back half of it. And I kind of want to ask a question to think will ground it is when we think about all the potential dimensions that I spoke about, what is it inherently that makes us now dismiss maybe 10 to 15 other dimensions in a very basic level of difference?
Was this question directed at Ngozi? Or maybe, Angie, was there something else you wanted to add?
Yes, I thought I unmuted myself.
Okay.
I thought it depends. If that question was directed to me, then I can say
Please.
something. I think there's another thing. I think another reason why these other dimensions that I just mentioned may not actually be, sort of like looked at as a focus point is probably because of where the entirety of DEI sits. In a lot of places. I think Angela is back. I can hold on for her.
No, please go ahead.
She's
And
gone
then we can
again.
have Angela.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think a lot of places where DEI sits, I know I was in a conference where I was like really clapping and giving the speaker an ovation, was where we tend to put DEI, we tend to lump it along with human resource, the human resource thing. Now, when you do that, you sort of minimize the impact that can be made from actually harnessing what DEI can bring to a situation, because it's all tipped towards the workplace. What are we doing for, the
Yes.
members of staff? What are we doing sometimes for the general ecosystem of an organization? And so it drops off from the bigger perspective of what DEI
Yes.
actually represents.
Mhm.
So the moment you talk to a leader in an organization that has already heard about DEI as an HR thing, then you lose them, because they don't realize that you're also talking about the community within which they live and what they can be bringing to the table. They all have corporate services. They all have. Do you see that? So corporate services are not just dealing with the workplace and the members of staff and the general ecosystem that is directly related to profit making. There is also the situation that's got to do with where your organization is situated. How is the community benefiting from you being there? And that's when you start to look at the other dimensions, gender in terms of children on the streets, you see. So it's gender, but it's the girl child on the street as against those using your organization. Persons with disabilities Africa is a place where persons of disabilities are disregarded. Disregarded, because when I speak from the built environment, and I know how difficult it is to get people to understand that the very little thing you design in to your construction, your infrastructure development, makes a whole difference and doesn't cost you more at the onset. It's tough, because they're not listening to you, because they're not understanding it. And then you try to lump it into DEI and you make a big mistake, because it's all termed HR. So I think that's my contribution to that. And I'm going to go away. I think Angela has made it back.
Yes.
I am back. I'm now on my phone. Leave the laptop. But Ngozi, before you go, I wanted to sort of like repose the question that I had, and I would love your perspective as well as everybody else. What is it about us, and I'll say us here as predominantly Africans, that makes us pick the most uncomfortable dimension of diversity and inclusion and throw out other aspects that are more just real about our reality, about our day to day? I mean, why do we go to the one that is, again, most controversial without looking at religious differences and how we get to the place of accepting that we have different religions and we must exist in society and in community and in organization together? You've talked a lot about people living with disabilities, whether they are permanent disabilities or temporary disabilities, visual or visible disabilities or not, they exist. And that's not where we naturally go. And I would say that this is something that in very culturally strong contexts, this is the knee-jerk reaction. And I wonder why that is the case, right? Because we are the ones who are in the organizations perpetrating this thing or not, and also being maybe judged by it, right? So I'm a believer, and when I tell people that I work in DEI, the first question they ask me is, how, as a Christian, do you work in this space when it's all about LGBTQ plus? And I'm like, it's not. It's about so many other dimensions. But if we are if we are moving this conversation to a level of, can I just say, quote unquote, complexity, without dealing with things that are just right in front of our eyes, male and female, generational, Gen Z versus boomers. You went to a grade school in the US. I went to a grade school in Kenya. You live in a rural environment, I live in an urban environment. All of these are dimensions of diversity. So for those of us who are here who are practitioners or leaders or just managers in corporate or societal spaces, what is it that makes us have that knee-jerk reaction to the thing that is most culturally complicated?
Angela, I think I'm just going to say something really brief, but I think from my own experience of trying to go into an area that is very, very difficult for people to accept in this part, there is this inherent blame culture that, sort of like permeates the African personality, or how will I put it? But there's this blame culture. We tend to point outwards a lot. So there's always someone who is causing you to be a certain way. I'm not trying to make it specific to Africans, but my observation whilst operating in the African space is perhaps we need to look more into the blame culture. So we blame someone else for something that is happening to us. Even if that person did that, what are we doing to mitigate against being driven downwards rather than progressing upwards? I don't know if you get what I mean. So there's a lot. I don't want to go into the space of race because obviously we're trying to say beyond race and LGBTQ, but I think we have to get to the place where we take ownership. If DEI is being practiced everywhere else as mostly focusing on race and LGBTQ, how about we take ownership about what DEI represents in Africa, for example? So we take the focus off those ones where they ask you why you're a Christian lady and, you know, accepting certain things, you know. And to be honest, I don't even know where being too religiously biased yourself can help to push, you know, the DEI initiative as it is. So if we take the focus off race and LGBTQ and call DEI what we need it to be in Africa, to move from point one on a level scale of 1 to 5 to the 3 where other people are, which is why they're now introducing the race and LGBTQ. We're currently on level 1. So we need
Yeah.
to deal with the stuff on level 1 before we head to 3 and then try to, you know, join the race with the rest at 5. And if we can do that with a very steep, you know, leap, then that's even good. So that's what I think. I think we need to start, we need to own it. We can't
Yeah.
look to those who, you know, came up with the DEI initiative to drive it. We need to own it in
Absolutely.
Africa.
And this is why when I talk to individuals who are keen to build, let me not say careers, but build a practice around understanding, exploring, committing to embedding DEI in the spaces that they work in, one of the things that I always talk about is, and I talk about it, but I also hear potential clients talk about it, is where did this move, let me put move in inverted commas, to spend so much time talking about DEI, that it's such a forefront discussion, come from? And when we think about it, we do need to look at historically the reason why certain geographies, certain communities have had the opportunity to begin engaging in DEI conversations earlier than others. So if you think, for example, about what happened in South Africa during apartheid, it quote unquote forced a discussion around DEI from a racial perspective, but that now means that if you go to South Africa and you talk about DEI, they're not necessarily talking about it in the same level one stage that you've just talked about, Ngozi, as we are maybe in Kenya or any other country in East Africa, because they've had 15 to 20 years of unpacking what race means for them in their context, building policies, frameworks, structures in response to their cultural and political context. I would hazard to say that the same thing is applicable if you look at the journey that individuals in North America, or societies in North America and in Europe and in Australia, who for very many reasons along their societal and political and immigration related dynamics have been able to, and I'm going to say this, I wish you could see me, but I'm like cringing to say this, move past some of what we consider to be the first levels of dimensions of diversity. And I'm cringing because we know that they have not moved past race. We know that they have not moved past all aspects of gender inclusivity, but they're now at a place where it is very normal and completely important for their context to be discussing some aspects of diversity and inclusion that if you bring it up on the continent, and maybe I would say even in Asia, people would be like, what? Can we at least first deal with like social economic status before you start asking me about, matters to do with inclusion of individuals who choose to undergo, let's say, a transition from one gender to another. So it's also about recognizing how long we've been on this journey, and to recognize that we're really just starting. We've been talking about gender for a long time in many of our countries on the continent. Ethnicity has been an issue. Social economic status is an issue, but we haven't, can I say, reached that place or graduated to that place where we can actually tackle all aspects of dimensions of diversity, because we haven't dealt with some of the things that may appear to us as more foundational. Again, cringing, because who determines what foundational is? I don't know. Question up in the air, right?
Thank you so much for that, Angie. And Ngozi, great insights as well. And I think that's one of the things that is important to highlight in this conversation, right? What metric are we using, right? What foundation are we using? A lot of times we could say some of these are potentially very US centric. For those of you who are in the audience, if any of you would like to join us on stage to share your perspective, please feel free to raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you as well. Akusia, I saw you unmuted at some point. Was there something that you wanted to share?
Yes, thank you. I did want to say, I think somebody mentioned, why do we always go to the extreme? And I would like to say that it depends on how your community and what you're discussing. I don't know what extreme to you in your community when you're discussing DEI, but I will tell you this, based on where I work, the community I live in, the people I associate with. When we talk DEI, the context of that conversation is dominated by all things LGBTQI+. And that is what I think the general person takes from DEI. So they can come to the question like, how can a Christian woman, all of these things, because we haven't done a great job of educating the community that inclusion for all in all matters. And we have allowed DEI to be dominated by a certain demographic. And so to the average Joe, yes, they can question us because, and I have a big problem with, us going into another country, disrespecting their cultural norms, how you view it, because don't take, for me, I grew up in Ghana, I grew up in Texas, so I'm both. I'm here, I still respect my culture, but you should not step into someone's country and impose on them what you feel is right in your country, because that in itself also is colonization. When you step into someone's country, you should learn what their cultural norms are. And so even if this DEI is up for discussion, that's when we begin to talk about respect for other persons, for religion, because the other person walking around, all they know DEI might be, oh, here they are trying to indoctrinate me about LGBTQ. So I just wanted to paint the picture of, I think that sometimes DEI practitioners, I'm not a DEI practitioner, but I challenge all of you that it can be very forceful and almost like you are disrespecting what I believe because you want to impose on me what you believe. And in that sense, no, it is not okay. So start with respecting my cultural boundaries, and just simply imposing wherever DEI integrated from or began from on another one's culture, right? It's also not okay. I do believe in equity and inclusion, but I think sometimes we go about it the wrong way because we come from a very Western centric manner when we are approaching this topic in an African world. Thank you.
Such a great point. Ekwa, let me just make a quick comment on that.
Go ahead.
I once, not too long ago, had to facilitate a workshop for maybe 9 to 10 nonprofits that were in Africa-based, mostly East Africa-based. And funded by the forum was funded by a Western, quote unquote, Western organization. And when we were in the room, a lot of them asked the question, whose agenda is it, right? That we are here discussing DEI. It was a very interesting conversation, obviously, because for those of you who are a bit more involved in DEI, particularly in the programmatic space, that power dynamic around what the funder decides is important, really shows up. And what was beautiful about that conversation is we got to go around the room and challenge the nonprofits to think about the reality of their particular context. And this wasn't even a geographical context, because we had, people in education and people in nutrition and people in health. And it wasn't so, and they were all, in one country, but it was more about can we even get to the place where we can ask one another, what does DEI mean to you in your context? What are the aspects of inclusion or of diversity that matter the most to you in your context? And I would say, if we can get to the place where whenever an organization or a community or a society is trying to explore avenues of building more inclusive societies, they start by the recognition, which is what I think Akosia, I'm so sorry, I will get it right, was making reference to, of first taking the posture of learning what's up in this space, what matters in this space, what are we sensitive about in this space, what is a no-go zone in this space, and start from there, right? Because the minute we start to impose our perspectives on different dimensions, then we get to a place where we are actually by default non-inclusive, right? And where I see this as being particularly challenging is when you see organizations that want to have a global policy on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and putting metrics that must be met by every geo or every function. It's not possible, because the things that matter most importantly to every geography, and even within that sub-geographies, like if you look at Nigeria, for example, I'm positive that if you had a conversation about diversity and inclusion in the north and in the south, you would get different perspectives. It's the same thing in Kenya. It's probably the same thing in many other parts of the world. But starting with that posture of curiosity and desire to learn and respect what is the norm, and then move alongside from that. Last point, I've done a bit of work with a team in India, and it was very interesting because if you go to India, just about every race is represented in India because of how large the continent is, the subcontinent is, sorry, the number of nations that are along the borders, just, migration, et cetera, et cetera. But they're probably the only country that has to grapple with a caste issue or a caste issue, depending on how you like to pronounce it. And that is such a foreign concept to many of us in 2023. But for them, the caste dynamic is a real and present diversity and inclusion dynamic, which I've never encountered it until this particular project that I was working on. So if you went there and tried to talk about, equality without trying to understand, and I did say equality, not equity, I mean this equality, without trying to understand the hundreds of years that led them to the place where they have a very, even, politically entrenched caste system, you'd almost be like shooting yourself in the foot. Like, there's just no way to unpack that from a dominant perspective of, everybody should be the same. So you really have to take that posture of curiosity, humility as well, and just seeking to learn and understand and allow the agenda to be set from that particular society.
Thank you so much, Angie. Context matters. Thank you, Akosia, for bringing us to this point. I'd love to just check in with the audience. Can you let us know, just use a reaction, an emoji. Are you a DEI professional, a DEI practitioner? Do you do DEI within your workplace? Let us know by just reacting by using an emoji. It'd be really interesting to just have a better understanding of who's in the room. If you are a DEI practitioner, expert, professional. All right, Beatrice, thank you. Yes, Jessica, nice to see you. Lauren, yes, thumbs up. Okay, Samuel. Okay, great. This is amazing. So If any of you want to share your perspective, I also want to welcome you to join us on the stage, but it's nice to see there are some practitioners here. I'd love to get to my next question. Angie, you sort of alluded to this because Ngozi started talking about it, but I'd love for us to take this a little further. One of the things that we discussed when we were putting together this conversation was that DEI is more than an HR initiative. How can organizations truly embed DEI within their day-to-day work, within work engagements? What can be done to make sure it doesn't just stay within HR? And of course, I'd love to invite everyone also to share their perspective after Angie.
I will try and be brief on the broadest question of the evening.
Start wherever you like.
Yeah, I think if we truly believe in the power of bringing different to the table, right? That could be different perspectives, different experiences, different skill sets, et cetera, then we recognize, and I think there's been lots of studies around this, that if in the right environment, difference can actually lead to a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity, a lot of maybe not efficiency all the time, because by the time you listen to all the different perspectives and consider them all, it can actually be a little bit slower to move forward. But generally what we find is when people are comfortable with different perspectives, you come up with a pretty darn good outcome. And so if that's the case, then I would say that any business, any organization, any even government should understand that this is an opportunity to come up with really great solutions for the business, right? Just by enabling people with different perspectives to contribute their perspective. Now that speaks a little bit more to like belonging and creating spaces of psychological safety, et cetera, but I sense, and this is my experience as well, is that when we leave it to just an HR dynamic, while that is probably the most important starting place, because there's already so much inherent inequity, lack of diversity, and non-inclusion in organizations, we can deal with unconscious bias another day and how that leads to, to that scenario. If we leave it at just, how do I make my workplace more diverse? How do I provide benefits and workplace initiatives that allow for more diversity, equity, and inclusion? That's great, by the way, don't get me wrong. I just think that we are not taking an abundant approach to what the DEI mindset, and I should add there the B, DEIB mindset can do for an organization. There's very few organizations that exist to solve really simple issues, right? And so when you're dealing with complex issues, what you need is diverse perspectives. What you need is diverse experience. And so if we can create organizations that leverage diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging as a tool to come up with best solutions, then I think it's really where you really get to reap the dividends of DEI. HR is critical, best starting place ever. I think it's difficult to talk about DEI from a programming lens or from a supply chain lens when you haven't taken care of your people at home. But I do think it is quite a narrow view if we limit it to HR. When I do my work, I do encourage organizations to start there because it's the most authentic place to start. But it's also not necessarily always sustainable. And we do need to get to the place where we look at DEI as more than just a cost center, which is just like sucking the money away, for all the different initiatives that need to be invested in, et cetera, when you can actually reap a number of dividends. Last thing I want to say about that is, from an African perspective, we haven't been great at collecting sufficient data or tracking metrics appropriately to be able to know whether this actually has translated with evidence into better business outcomes, et cetera, and we need to be patient around that. I think other continents have been doing this a lot longer, so they can say, we've seen the dividends being reaped from it, the financial dividends, the business growth dividends. We're not yet there, but I think that's why the sooner we all start finding some place to start our DEI journey, the better, and tracking metrics is really, really important.
Thank you so much for that, Angie, right? So keeping in mind that, ultimately, right, a business wants to make money, a business wants to be more efficient. So making sure you're collecting that type of data alongside whatever initiatives, programming that you're implementing, and the way in which you're shifting things up in relation to DEIB. Thank you so much for that. Anyone else want to share their perspective, or maybe even share maybe an activity or programming or policies that have worked within their organization on the continent that's worked for them? Beatrice, amazing. Anyone else, please feel free to raise your hand. We'd love to have you.
Beatrice is not back in the speaker corner.
Okay, trying to get her up.
Do you need to, can you have more than 4 at a go?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Sometimes it is a technical thing on their end as well. In the meantime, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I was going to say, you can kick me off the platform in case it allows you.
Okay, I'll go ahead and try that, but I don't think that's going to work, but we'll see. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to contribute something. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank
Yes,
you.
you can. Yes, I was going to contribute something to what Angela said, and it made me giggle a bit when she said, "At least start somewhere, start in HR," and then she had a caveat to that as well. She says, "But it can also be done a different way," which is true because there is this start how you want to finish. So if you limit within the walls of HR, then it might be a little difficult for people to come out of the business as usual that you eventually establish to then take it out broader. So that I just giggled at that because she said it and then she made a caveat on it which is why, rather than HR, you might want to be looking at corporate services as a whole, which HR sits in most organizations, so that they then pick it up from there. But that's just something I just noticed. But what do you do to move things forward? I would look at this as a program. I would look at EI and how to it. It's sort of generate some form of awareness of what the 3 components actually mean. In some people, they've added belonging. In some, they've added justice at the end. So we have EI and B, DI and J. But you see, the diversity component is what I see as very lacking in the African context of everything. We tend not to really understand what we're referring to in terms of diversity. And so I think for the African context, if we can start to say, look, if you introduce this bit a little bit more and pay attention to it, then your return on investments will be positively affected by it, you taking up that diversity angle of it. So, start to let people understand how bringing in different kinds of people can actually help you to make more. So, like Angela was saying, the measuring, measuring things, coming up with statistical data, we tend to lack. And where they're available, we tend to have difficulty getting them from the bodies that are responsible for them. Because if you have those, then the organizations who are practicing this can show how it has affected the return on investments. In which case it will attract other people to do same. But we haven't got those details. Those details, my dears, is what DEI people should try and get to be seen. We have to have a way of getting, and just before I disappear, I'm not disappearing, but I think I'll be quiet, is we need to understand, because somebody else said where I'm based. Africa is a continent, not a country. Every country has that area which they need to focus on and build up on. So we also need to understand that we need to break these things down. So on the general perspective on the African continent, we can pick 1 or 2 areas that are general to all of us and push those. And then for those that are more intricate to particular countries, we encourage each other and support each other Now I'm echoing. Can you all hear me? Because I'm
Yes,
echoing now.
you're good. I
Okay.
think
Yeah.
yeah, I was
Okay.
muted. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So if we can then support each other and build those areas that need to be, built in the different countries, so that we stop lumping everything together for the African continent. The issues in South Africa include race.
Mm-hmm.
The issues in Nigeria do not particularly include race.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe Aqua, you can say the same for Ghana. So that's what I mean. They're not highlighted in that way. So we need to also understand those bits.
Well said. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think one of the themes I keep hearing is the importance of context, right? And recognizing we can't necessarily have the same thing everywhere, right? And I think especially within multinational organizations or organizations maybe that receive funding from somewhere, it's important also to get curious and question. And Angie, I love how you put it, sort of what, whose agenda. Please, Angie.
No, now I really want to hear Beatrice, but I was just the only reason I unmuted was because I'm so happy Ngozi caught my giggle about about start somewhere. And the reason I did that is because what we're seeing, what I'm seeing, like as an active DEI in Africa practitioner, is because of the global movement around DEI, there's such a rush to start somewhere. Like there's whether it's headquarter pressure or whatever, everyone feels like, oh my gosh, I don't have a DEI policy, I don't have a DEI strategy, I'm not talking DEI. So then they're just trying to rush. And in many instances, before they engage somebody who is a practitioner or has had some experience, they put something together quickly. And the first point of contact is the HR space. And that's why I did have that little chuckle, right? Because I'm never going to be like, oh guys, you've really missed the mark by not starting beyond the people. But I do think that when we find or encounter an organization that's where they've started and we notice that they haven't expanded it to include more, there's an onus on us as leaders, as practitioners, to push the discussion to be more about, whether it's a program or whether it's just embedding it as a very critical component of our operations. To push the discussion away from just HR. But I'm recognizing that we have little time and I really want to hear from Beatrice. So Beatrice, over to you.
Thank you, Angela. I'm really enjoying this discussion. And in response to how do you move it away from HR, of course, we recognize that it starts there. But one thing companies can do and practitioners can do is look at the whole value chain of the company, from where you source your raw materials to when you deliver this. You look at DEI as a value chain. From a value chain perspective, that means looking at all the series of consecutive steps that go into creation of your products or services, from the initial design to the arrival at the customer's place, and also how your product, you're sustainably maintaining it and making sure that you're taking care of the environment. That means, yes, you will have to start at the workplace because that's where it starts. But again, you'll have to look at the marketplace, you'll have to look at the community, you'll have to look at logistics, you'll have to look at the supply chain. Are you, for example, once you've identified the pillars that are relevant for you, let's take, for example, women. Are you sourcing from women? Are women part of the logistics when you're supplying? Are women part of the customers that are using your product, but also able to participate in selling your product? Are you empowering women in the communities that you operate in? What is the impact of your product to women once you've done that? How are you advertising your product out there? Is it demeaning to women or is it not demeaning to women? What are the issues within the community that are taking place that you need to address, whether it's something to do with female genital mutilation or discrimination of child not going to school? Then as a responsible company, then you will play in that field because that's a pillar that you've identified. That way you're able to move it away from HR. But yes, it will start as HR, but then you need to look at all the value chain against the pillar that you have chosen to play in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. And just a quick question for you. Which department would be sort of in charge of potentially overseeing, and maybe that's not the way it's set up, but I'd be curious to know, is there another department or would it be a project or program that would be overseeing, for example, that supply chain is engaging suppliers that are women? I'd love to hear a little bit more about how and what that looks like in practice?
All right. So in practice, for our case, it began with the HR department, but then as it matured, it moved to the sustainability department.
Interesting.
Because that's also another department that is coming up in most organizations. So sustainability is able to oversee all these other departments, making sure as you transport your product, like in our case in Kenya, then the transport industry is predominantly male.
Yes.
But because you've chosen this pillar, you've chosen the gender pillar, and you're looking at how women are impacted by your product, then you want to create employment within logistics. And hence you start impacting that from the driving school, making sure that you're encouraging more women to be truck drivers, working with the government to make sure that the roads are safe, and that women are able to look at that as a career choice, or maybe as a masonry or in construction, which again, in this area, women don't play a lot in that. But because that is the area that you're in and that's the product that you produce, then, and you have chosen this pillar, then you look at it from the value chain, and then you go impact in each of these. So you source for raw materials. So do women provide these raw materials? What is happening in the community that they're not able to, for example, own mines and able to provide these products for you? Is there anything that you can do about that? Then slowly by slowly, you start influencing and impacting that. And like we say in diversity, it is not a destination, it's a journey. You have to start learning slowly, but keep the eye on the ball, keep the eye on the goal, and keep measuring, keep communicating, and make sure that reports are given to the highest level of the organization so that they can see what is happening.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that, Beatrice. It's great to hear a little bit more about what you've seen and what's worked and how that works in practice. Thank you. To close us off, Angie, any last words? Just keeping, it's already at time, but any last words, anything else that we should keep in mind, you think that DEI practitioners should keep in mind? Yeah.
So one is just what Beatrice has said. This thing is not a destination. It's like a full journey. And I sense that even as we get to, when you set a strategy or you set a set of, metrics or objectives that you're trying to reach, targets that you're trying to achieve, by the time we get there, something is going to have shifted, whether within our workforce or within the society that we're operating. We're working in regulatory environments that are moving every day, legal environments that are moving every day. And so if we don't, as practitioners, have the agility to think about what it means to adjust to a new context, which moves faster, and build structures that support the organization as we move, then we're going to be caught on the left foot, right? Or on the wrong foot, and then be asked the question around, like, what was the point of this interaction? The second thing that I want to say is, this is one of those practices that abundance is critical. There's no one of us here who can crack diversity in Africa by themselves, right? And so while there sometimes can be like, a lot of competition in certain spaces, I really believe that this is not the one. And so the sooner we begin to work together to understand various dimensions of diversity and expertise and practice for ourselves on the continent, then the sooner we'll be able to, I think, shift the needle. And it's literally about shifting the needle. It's not about resolving all aspects, about shifting the needle. And then the final thing I'm going to say, which, I think we've touched on it, not only is it not an HR issue, it's also not an isolated DEI practitioner issue. So if you're in finance, this is your issue. If you're in supply chain, this is your issue. If you're in marketing, it's your issue. If you're a funder, it's your issue. This is everybody's issue. And we need to recognize our biases, our power dynamics within the organization and the sectors that we work in if we're going to make a shift. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Angie. Thank you all who are listening and still listening even over time. Please show Angie some love by reacting, using an emoji to show her how much you appreciate what she's contributed. And thank you all, Kusia, Beatrice, and Gozi. Thank you as well for joining us on stage to share your perspective. Angie, can you let people know how they can reach you if they're interested in learning more about what you do or want to continue the conversation?
Absolutely. Please be my friend on LinkedIn. You can see my name, Angela Gachui. Please send me I don't know what they call. They're not friend requests. A connection.
Yes.
That's the one. You can be my friend too. And second of all, if you want to email me, Angela at the number 3, B for boy, L for love, Africa.com. If you're in Nairobi, would love to connect. I'm actually thinking of how to create like a few, I guess, practice circles where we can talk as Africans on matters related to DEI. So if you're keen to do that, please let me know. But that is the best way to reach me. LinkedIn, you see my name, please reach out.
Love it. So for those of you who don't know, you can actually click on Angie's head. So if you see the little bubble when she talks, you can click on the 3 dots and you can follow her there and you can connect with her there as well. It's quite easy. Thank you all so very much for taking the time to join me this Friday. I really appreciate it. We have a conversation every single Friday at the same time. So I look forward to seeing many of you next week as well. And just thank you so much again for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Sakura. That was so much fun. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you
Thank
so much
you.
for joining.
Bye.